Marshall Schott joins me this week to discuss the Brulosophy experiments, Hop Chronicles, and his new podcast. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 159. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 159, and it's early November 2017. This week, Marshall Schott joins me to discuss his Brulosophy experiments, the Hop Chronicles, Schott and Shoddy, and his new podcast. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now. Get 20% off your subscription when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers, and you can read my new column there, which is called Ask the Experts. Take advantage of their special deal when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the new BrewVision Thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download your recipes right from the BeerSmith cloud and set updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. It includes all the tools you need to create recipes on the go, share them with friends, and act as a pocket brew timer. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on the Google Play, iTunes, or Amazon app stores. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Marshall Schott. Marshall runs the Brulosophy.com website, which features a wide variety of interesting beer experiments, where he takes common brewing beliefs and puts them to the test, so to speak. In addition, Marshall has a number of new projects we'll be talking about, including his new podcast, something called the Hop Chronicles, and another feature called Schott and Shoddy. Marshall, it's great to have you back on the show, my friend.
It's great to be back, Brad. Thanks for having me on again.
How's life out there in California?
It's, the sun is still out and we're still getting days in the 80s where I live, so I cannot complain. I've got some friends who are in other parts of the United States, and I've seen some snow, flurries on the ground. So I'm happy to report that we're not in a place like that.
I'm actually upset here because it's late October here when I'm recording. This is going to be released in early November, but it's late October and the leaves are coming out and it's beautiful, but it's still like 70-something degrees out. It just seems wrong.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We live in a place where we want it to stay warm, and there are people who live in places where they kind of want it to cool off. So, I like going out and brewing this time of year because it doesn't take me forever to chill my wort, which is kind of a nice change from brewing in 110 degree summers.
I agree. I actually just went by the brew store and picked up some stuff for a stout, so I'm getting ready to do that.
Awesome. I've made your stout before, actually. It's a great beer.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple parties and we finished some kegs, so I've got some empty ones now.
Very good.
I wanted to, we want to talk about a whole bunch of projects today. Actually, you got a whole bunch of things going on. But I wanted to start with some of the experiments, or you call them experiments.
Oh boy.
Which have been the mainstay at Brulosophy.com. Why don't you just walk us through what a typical experiment looks like for those of you that may not have listened last time we did this?
Yeah, sure. So, when I started performing experiments in 2014, I like to get this out there because I think people seem to they view us as trying to disprove convention and whatnot. And that really isn't the point. So when I started doing experiments back in 2014, I actually expected to use the results as a way to prove why certain methods are necessary. For example, kettle trub and keeping it out of the fermenter. How not doing so would lead to a hazy beer with grassy off flavor, stuff like that. Curiously, as coincidence would have it, many of the variables we've tested in the 165 experiments we've done haven't come back with the, I guess, expected results. So typical experiment, we take a variable and then we design the experiment around that variable. If it's something like kettle trub, we figure out a way to make two beers that are as identical as possible with the exception of the one variable, the in this case it would be kettle trub. Then you brew the beers and you treat them identically otherwise and serve them to participants in what's called a triangle test. It's a sensory analysis approach, and you take the people's ability to distinguish the odd beer out in a triangle test, and you run it through a statistic, and then you get a p-value, and we can say with at least some degree of confidence whether or not a variable seemed to have a noticeable impact.
Right, and I wanted to mention that all of them are listed. I'll put your website up there. All of them are listed at brulosophy.com. You got, as you mentioned, over 160 of them now, which is kind of, and some are very interesting. I wanted to start with a couple of them. Let's do some of the most recent ones. Let's talk about your recent one, pitching a starter versus under pitching for a high gravity beer. I thought that one was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. So we've actually done a couple experiments looking into the impact of yeast pitch rate, something that a lot of us have been taught is one of the two most important things for making good beer. That with fermentation temperature control. The proper yeast, right? And all but one of the experiments that we've done have returned non-significant results on this, which is pretty interesting. And that one compared a Kolsch fermented with either a lager or ale pitch rate, and 15 out of 30 tasters were able to select the unique sample in a triangle test, which seriously just barely pushed us into that zone of statistical significance. But this wasn't the case in two other experiments, one comparing amber ales fermented with a single pack of yeast or an appropriately sized starter, and the other comparing fest beers, which is a lager, fermented with either a single pack of dry yeast, the popular 3470, or 5 packs of the same yeast. So we had one kind of comparing an underpitch to a standard pitch rate, and then the other one comparing a underpitch to an overpitch, and neither of those returned significant results. Which basically, the way we're able to determine that is that the number of tasters who were able to discern the odd beer out in a triangle test wasn't high enough for us to say with any confidence that there was a real difference between the beers. Naturally, this led to some comments from people online, which happens a lot, about the idea that maybe a higher OG beer would be more sensitive to yeast pitch rates due to things like higher osmotic pressure on the yeast or even increased exothermic heat just from fermentation. So we decided to test it out. One of our new contributors, Matt Del Fiacco, a big fan of big beers, brewed up a couple batches of an 1108 OG Russian Imperial Stout. That's 1.108 OG, a very, very big beer. One of them was pitched with a single can of Imperial Organic A10 Darkness, which is like the Guinness strain. And the other one was hit with an appropriately sized starter. So the idea, it was something like this. You would, at least, I don't know, in my mind, I expected the underpitched beer to have maybe a stronger ester character, certainly be more noticeably different than the beer that was pitched with a starter.
And did you use the same yeast on both of them? I'm trying to remember here.
Yeah. Both were pitched with that same darkness yeast from Imperial Organic, and it's just that one of them was built up in a starter, and the other one was pitched direct from the can. Right now, they're doing they package in cans. Interestingly, I expected and this is just kind of my own dogma, I suppose, but I expected the beer fermented with a starter to finish quicker and with a lower finishing gravity than the one that was pitched straight from the can, but they finished about 0.002 points apart, which really isn't much. The direct pitch batch finished at 1031 SG, and the yeast starter batch finished at 1029, so not too big of a difference there. So when the beers were finished, Matt carbonated them up. They looked pretty similar, and he served them to 22 participants for the blind triangle test, 12 of whom would have had to make the right selection to reach statistical significance, yet only 10 were able to pick the odd beer out. So just under half, which does not allow us to say that these beers were different enough for a reliable number of participants to distinguish the difference.
I guess the other question is, were you using fresh yeast, or were you using, was it a little bit older?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so the yeast were very fresh. In fact, if I recall correctly, he received the yeast direct from Imperial Organic like a week before he pitched, before he made the starter and pitched the can into the batch.
So I guess that's not too horribly surprising if you got probably 100 billion cells there, right, for a can or something like that.
That was one of the things that came up after we published this article. Imperial Organic is what they're kind of known for is giving brewers more yeast than some of the other companies. So they market that they give each can contains about 200 billion cells. That may have made the difference. And you've got all of these companies who are saying that they're selling pitchable counts of yeast. So you should be able to make any good beer using just a single pitch. I still think the kind of conventional wisdom of the day is that you still need to make a starter just to ensure a healthy fermentation and to avoid off flavors.
Yeah, I mean, generally you don't need it with a dry yeast. You can just throw another pack in there, but certainly with a liquid yeast, I think it's a good idea. My own opinion, but.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, despite these results, and it's starting to stack up, not necessarily against making starters, but certainly not against pitching direct. What we're finding is that you can make a good beer without worrying about that. And I give credit, to the yeast manufacturers for giving us a quality product.
Yeah, and they've also gotten much better at preserving the product over a period of months, as opposed to having it degrade fairly rapidly, which is good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that doesn't, we still all make starters and doesn't mean I'm always going to. I think I will feel, a little more comfortable if I feel like skipping the starter making process in the future. But
okay, well, let's go on another experiment. The infamous question. I've actually had this question quite a bit. Squeezing the bag when you're working with brewing a bag. Of course, you pull that giant grain bag out of the pot, right? And the debate, the eternal debate, is whether you squeeze it or not. Or are you going to get tannins if you squeeze the bag? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, that is this has been an issue for as long as I've been hearing about brewing a bag. And in fact, when I got into brewing, I was doing extract with steeping grains, and I very distinctly recall being told, do not squeeze the steeping grain bag because you're gonna make an astringent beer and it's gonna have all these off flavors. So, and it sort of makes sense, I guess, at least when somebody with a little bit of authority tells you not to squeeze a bag. I listened. So recently, though, a lot of us with Brulosophy have adopted the use of these fabric filters in our own setups. I use one in a mash tun, and then we've got a couple guys who actually use the bags in a typical electric brew in a bag type setup. And so we were curious if squeezing actually did make a difference or not, and designed an experiment to test it out. Contributor Jake Houlihan brewed up 2 batches of the same English bitter, both brewed using the BIAB method. But only one in which the bag was squeezed after the mash. And in fact, he accounted for the different absorption rates in BeerSmith to ensure both have the same pre-boil volume NOG. And kudos, Brad, because it worked beautifully.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. They both started at the same OG, and he got the same pre-boil volume out of both batches. So once the beers were finished, he served them to 27 participants, all blind to the variable, of course. And this sample would require 14 to correctly identify the unique beer to imply significance, yet only 8 made the correct selection, which is actually less than 1/3, which is what you'd expect by random guessing alone. So pretty surprising.
So you can go ahead and squeeze the bag now, right?
Well, I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? But interestingly, now, and I think it behooves me to say there was one difference, and it was an observable one. The beer where the bag was squeezed actually maintained a slight haze, while the non-squeezed beer, if you will, was pretty crystal clear, almost bright. So something about the squeezing seemed to have impacted the clarity of the finished beer. But other than that, people couldn't really taste the difference between them.
Yeah, I had one of those last spring. I had a new grain mill I got a motorized grain mill, great thing, but I forgot to adjust it before I started brewing. And as a result, ended up with with a beer that was actually pretty hazy and also kind of a stuck mash I had to work through. It was kind of a mess, but,
Oh, those are always fun, aren't they?
Yeah, it's my own fault, Should have taken 10 minutes and adjusted the thing.
Yeah, right. Well, we've all been there, so.
Yeah. Let's see. You did one on first wort hops versus straight boil hops. That's a technique I like to use a lot. First wort hopping, of course, is where you steep the hops as you're finishing the mash, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the common method for homebrewers is to toss in an initial hop addition into the kettle dry, and then you lauter on top of the hops, and then bring that wort up to a boil. So the hops, ostensibly the hops are in contact with the wort a little bit longer than they would be if a typical 60-minute bittering addition. So you're getting another 15 or 20 minutes contact time between the hops and the wort. Mm-hmm. So we've actually done 2 experiments on this one. It's a method that I've been using for coming up on 10 years now. And I've got my reasons for doing it. The reasons that I read about were that it would impart that first wort hopping imparts not only a smoother bitterness, but it can actually have an impact on the finished aromatic characteristic of a beer. So basically, if you use certain hops too early in the boil, you're going to drive off a lot of those aromatic compounds. But if you throw them in at first wort hop, there is some carryover, is what I read. And so to test this out, I made back in 2015, the first one I did, I made a beer. It was a Helles style beer that I ended up taking to what is now called HomebrewCon, but NHC and down in San Diego. Nice big group of 39 participants, many of whom were BJCP judges, and of course at NHC it's all craft beer drinkers and homebrewers. Out of 39 participants, 19 would have needed to to select the odd beer out in order to imply significance, yet only 15 did. So just a hair under a third, or a hair over a third of the people were able to identify the odd beer out. And interestingly, none of them were able to speak to any of the differences that they experienced between the beers. So that one did not produce significant results, which was pretty surprising to me.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember the original paper, believe it or not, was done in the 90s. And it was somebody, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was a group in Germany were actually trying to revamp it was a German method, I believe, first wort hopping, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was developed in Germany as far as we can tell on our research.
Right,
yeah.
and then there was a group in it was like mid-90s, late 90s that did a paper on this, and they supposedly did a blind taste test and found some significant results, but you found the opposite.
Well, yeah, and I think we just recorded a podcast about this very issue. In fact, that will be going live this evening. In fact, and what that German research group found was they people were able to distinguish the beers, and I hate to. I don't know it exactly at this point, but what they did is they compared a beer that had where a portion of the later addition hops, so what you might refer to as an aroma addition, a 30% portion of those were used as the first wort hop. And, what we kind of refer to that as like the German method. Whereas in America, first wort hopping has been used largely as a way to get a somewhat smoother, less sharp bitterness. And so you're using either a large portion of or the entire 60-minute bittering hop addition for the first wort hop addition. And that's what we tested. So
that's right.
Yeah, and so what we wanted to do is, and what we plan to do is in future first wort hop experiments, actually look at the impact that using a portion of those later hop additions might have. The difficulty with that is designing it such that both batches, are identical otherwise, because if indeed that first wort hop addition is having an impact on the bittering component, well, that could be what is making people. Or that's what could be what people are noticing, and not so much the aroma aspect of it.
And that's, of course, almost certainly the case, right?
Well, it seems like it would be. Yeah, it seems like it would be. But so one of the things with that first experiment was that there were 2 hop additions. I think I don't have the recipe in front of me, but we did a first wort hop addition in place of a 60-minute. And then I think I added in both beers, I added a 15-minute addition as well. And then, curious if maybe that had an impact, I just decided to kind of replicate the experiment again. And recently, just a couple months ago, brewed up a Pilsner type beer and just used a first wort hop addition versus a 60-minute hop addition. No other hops were used in the making of those beers. And And in that one, I actually took samples of both beers and sent them into Oregon Brew Lab for testing IBUs, and was really that finding was really curious. I'll get to that in a bit. But for the sensory analysis, we had 21 participants. 12 would have needed to get it right in order to say that it was a significant difference, and only 7 did, which is precisely 1/3, which is exactly what you'd expect if people were just randomly picking. Yeah. So pretty surprising results there.
Yep. Okay.
And so, well,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so, no, it's okay. For the expected IBU, the expected, the calculated IBU was 25, about 25 for both batches. They weren't too terribly off. But interestingly, when we sent them in for testing to the lab, the first wort hop beer came back with an IBU of about 15.5. While the 60-minute edition beer came back with an IBU of about 13.5. So they're about the same, but I think the surprising finding there is just how off they are from the Tinsith formula.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly possible. I think if you talk, I had Glenn Tinseth actually on the show way back, and I think in like the first season, and even he'll tell you, I think that he did the experiments on one set of equipment. And measured it for, a limited set of recipes, really, quite honestly. So.
Yeah, I think I recall that episode, and I believe he mentioned something about his formula being based on whole cone hops as well, and not so much hop pellets, which is what most of us are using these days. So I think there's a lot of I think we've got a lot of to learn about bittering and whatnot, and it'll be interesting to see where we go.
I guess the other interesting thing is most people can't taste about a 10 IBU difference in most cases. So,
yeah, I've heard 10 IBU. I've heard 5 IBU. I'm not sure I'd be able to taste a 25 IBU difference at this point, but
it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's go on to loose versus bagged hops. That was another one you did. So I assume this is during the boil. You put in loose hops versus bagging your hops, right?
Yeah, actually, we've run 2 experiments on the impact of hop bags. One of them looking at the impact during kettle hopping during the boil, and the other one during the dry hop. And we've got a future experiment plan to combine those 2 together and see if there's an impact. But basically, we brewed up a beer. I brewed up I think it was a pale ale the first time, and one of them had the hops bagged in a typical fabric filter that you'd get. I think you can buy them at paint stores these days. And it was, it was a expected 44 IBU batch, 2 batches boiled simultaneously next to each other, same amount of hops, same everything. And one of them had them bagged. The other one had the hops tossed in loose into the boil. When the beers were done, I served them to 26 participants. 14 needed to get it right to reach significance. And that is exactly how many got it right. Which I thought was pretty interesting. And I was actually in this one pretty consistently able to tell the beers apart myself, being biased and having, known what the variable was. But the beers were different enough, at least for a reliable number of participants, to tell them apart.
So I assume the loose one was a little bit hoppier, or no?
I think that it was slightly higher IBU. We had these lab tested as well. The expected, again, was 44, and the measured for the bagged hop beer was 25 IBU and 27 IBU for the ones with the hops added loose into the kettle. So, yeah, you could say it was slightly more bitter. I'm not sure exactly how I was able to tell them apart. I do believe, if memory serves, that the bagged hop beer had a slightly more malty edge to it, but it wasn't necessarily lacking in hoppiness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty small bitterness difference for folks to pick that up. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not convinced it was actually the bitterness that got...
maybe some of the hop oils or aromatic oils or something like that coming through?
Yeah, something like that. That's kind of what I recall it tasting like, to me at least, that the bagged hop beer just had kind of a more malty characteristic to it. Neither were bad, they were both good. And if you've got if you're using a CFC or a plate chiller, you got to get those hops, out of the wort so that you're not clogging things up. So I didn't think it was too bad at all. You could probably just add more hops to make up for the difference.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. And so then we did the experiment where both beers in the kettle were hopped loosely, but then in the dry hop, one was bagged and the other one wasn't. And in that one, we had 21 participants, meaning 12 would need to get it right in the triangle test to reach significance, and only 9 did. So that one was not significant. So yeah, it's interesting to me that during the boil, it seemed to have some sort of an impact, yet during the dry hop, which is when a lot of people think, you're going to leave behind a lot of those hop oils and, on the bag, didn't seem to really make much of a difference at all.
Yeah, I almost always bag mine when I'm dry hopping anyways. The boil, I just throw them in there, but yeah.
Yeah, I never bag anything these days, actually.
Yeah, the only reason I bag my dry hops so I can take them out when I need to,
Yeah.
You did one recently on the effects of mash pH on beer flavor, and I don't think that one was significant either, right?
This was a really surprising one for all of us, actually. We've done a bunch of experiments exploring the impact of water chemistry in general on beer. And, I started off in the camp of, as long as your water tastes good, you're not going to be able to taste the difference if you toss in a teaspoon of gypsum or whatever it is. But surprisingly, this has been one of the most consistently significant variables that we've tested that have produced these distinguishable differences. And the differences have been pretty noticeable. So water does matter much more than I used to presume. When it comes to water chemistry, obviously there are 2 main parts, one of which is minerals, and the other one is pH. Minerals, we have been able to show, does have an impact. So what we decided to do is parse these out and brew. The first one we did, Jake Houlihan brewed a Pilsner with the same mineral profile, but one of them had a mash pH of 4.5, while the other had a mash pH of 5.3. A pretty significant difference when it comes to pH. 4.5 is pretty acidic, and 5.3 is kind of right around where you expect a beer to be. The expectation there was maybe that the 4.5 mash pH beer would have kind of a slight tartness to it, maybe not have nearly as good extract efficiency, stuff like that. That wasn't the case. He served this beer to 22 participants. 12 needed to select the unique sample in order to get it right, or in order to imply significance, and only 7 were correct. Completely unexpected result for all of us. And Jake himself had a difficult time telling these beers apart, and it was just totally surprising to us.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I know a lot of the work that has been done on mash pH is relating to commercial beers. And of course, they're not only concerned about the flavor, but the actual flavor stability over the long term, packaging, those kinds of things. Right. And I know the mash pH, at least from their results, does play a role there, but maybe not in the immediate, flavor taste of the beer. I don't know.
Yeah. The shelf stability piece really did come out when we published this experiment results, and perhaps that's the case, that the pH really, the biggest thing about pH. Though then you read things about stuff like, you want to make sure your pH is in the right spot when you're making a really dark or roasty beer because of the acidity of the roasted malts, and that's actually what inspired the second experiment on pH, where I brewed an IPA, and my thinking there was, hops are known to have, the ability to release these kind of astringent characteristics into beer.
Well, they have polyphenols, which are the same. Tannins are a form of polyphenol. So they can certainly do that.
Right. And so my thinking was, you've got, let's double up here. You've got the malt, which are known in the husks can release tannins, and then you've got the polyphenols of the hops. So an IPA is a perfect, I'm thinking there's no way this isn't going to be a non-significant result. I made two different mashes, 2 batches of beer. One, I had a mash pH at 5.2, which is, pretty ideal for a beer. And the other one, I used slaked lime to get the mash pH all the way up to 6.4. I mean, this is so far outside of the realm of what's ever recommended. I expected it just to be a terrible, totally noticeable difference. And so when the beers were done, I served them to 20 participants, which required 11 in order to say it was significant. And yet only 8 people were able to correctly identify the odd beer out, and not a single one of them was confident in their selection. I'm chatting with them after they do this test. So I actually went and took the triangle test myself numerous times, and I could not consistently identify the different beer. I was completely shocked.
What was the style of beer in this case?
It was an IPA. Yeah.
It was an IPA. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I could believe that. I guess the hops must be pretty dominant, I would think, right?
I would still, astringency is one of those things that, at least in my experience, it's a mouthfeel thing. I would think that it would cut through any flavors from the hops or the malt or anything like that and still be there. But that just wasn't the case.
Yeah. In some cases it comes across as like a bitterness, actually, almost like sucking out a tea bag, that kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah, I tend to experience astringency kind of in the back of my jaw. It's like a pinching in the back of my jaw. And so I was, knowing what I had done to these beers, that's kind of what I was looking for. And I got nothing, no difference between them. So really, really just crazy, interesting results. And I'll be the first one to say that does not mean I'm going to start mashing with crazy, pH. I still, I think 6 is usually the cutoff for runnings. So yeah, most people will cut off, professionals at least cut off their runnings around 6, I think. Oh, sure. Yeah. When it gets too high. Yeah. And I still, mess with my water profile and get it right where I want it before I brew any beer. But, I did think, at the very least, you forget to buy some acid or something like that, and you can't adjust your mash pH, you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, I know we made beer for a long time without ever adjusting our mash pH, and most of it was pretty good. Occasionally you dump one, but
sure.
Or you can blend it. That's the other trick I learned. Now that I've gotten more experience, I blend my beers when they're bad.
The fail safe, yeah.
Just blend it with a stout. Nobody will know.
Oh boy.
So anyways, you have a number of ongoing series. We probably can't get through them all here, but my favorite one, of course, I think the longest running one is the discussion on high temperature lager fermentation.
Yeah, you and me both. If I'm a lover of lager beers. I mean, my desert island beer is probably just a perfect German Pilsner. And so of course I wanted to make these on my own. And, for the first few years that I homebrewed, I just avoided them because I was so terrified of, screwing it up or I didn't have the ability to ferment it cool like you were supposed to and all of this. Well, what better excuse to test this out than running a website that does experimentation on this kind of stuff. So I'll just quickly kind of blow through all of the lager fermentation experiments that we've done. We've tested WLP 800. That's the Pilsner lager yeast, apparently Pilsner Urquell, at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C versus 66 F or 19 C. We've done we've done Saf lagers 3470 at 50 degrees Fahrenheit versus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so a 20 degree difference there. We've also done 3470 at 60 degrees Fahrenheit and versus 82 degrees Fahrenheit. We've compared Yeast 2124, which I believe is the same as the Weihenstephan strain, 3470, at 48 versus 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty big difference.
72, huh?
72, yeah. And we've done WLP 940 at 50 degrees Fahrenheit versus 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So lager versus ale temps. Out of those 5, 2 of them were significant. To me, this is pretty surprising. The one obvious one that was significant was 3470 fermented at 60 degrees compared to 82 degrees. However, in that experiment, if I recall correctly, the majority of people who correctly selected the unique sample in the triangle test actually preferred the beer that was fermented warm at 82 degrees. So,
and which style beer were you making there?
That was done by our contributor Greg Foster down in Southern California. I believe he just did a standard Pilsner, something like that. And and he said nobody commented on any esters or any fruitiness. It was actually noted as being cleaner than the 60 degree
at 80 fermentation. 82, you said? No,
82 with 3470, the workhorse, right? The other one that was significant, was the WLP 940, which is our most recent lager fermentation.
That's one right here.
Yeah. And that one fermented at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C versus 66F or 19C, and that one was significant, not by a huge margin, but even Jake said he was able to tell a difference between those ones pretty consistently. So, this is one of those things that the traditionalists don't like. This data, you're obviously doing something else wrong. We'll hear stuff like that. I've come to accept that I just think that yeasts are certain yeast strains are far more robust than we've given them credit for. And they're going to produce the character that they produce regardless, if within a certain degree, temperature range, they're going to produce the same results, but then there are other ones that are far more sensitive to temperature perhaps. And WLP 940 might, or at least it seems to be one of those.
Interesting. So it seems to be very dependent on what strain you're using, huh?
That so far, 3470 we've tested twice now, and I've just privately on my own, I've used 3470 fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C numerous times, and I've won awards. In fact, a Vienna lager that I fermented at 66 degrees with a lager yeast strain scored a 41 in the first round of 2016 NHC, I believe.
Wow, that's fantastic. Have you done any of the Marzen strains? I was interested.
So
I'm getting ready to do the Marzen, so I was wondering.
Yeah, and I know there's a few out there that are like the Oktoberfest strains or the Marzen strains. We haven't tested those out yet, but they're definitely, it's all fair game. Yep.
Have you been disappointed that many of the experiments didn't provide a statistically significant result? I'm going through the experiments, and there's only a handful that have been statistically significant.
Yeah, it's 33%, and that's pretty consistent over the last 2 years. Have I been disappointed? No. The truth is, I don't get emotionally caught up in stuff that, this is just beer. It's for fun. I don't really have any investment in the way things work one way or the other. I think more than anything, I've been shocked, and the lager fermentation temperature experiments have probably done that most to me, because you are supposed to ferment them cool, and there's this reason you're supposed to, and everybody talks about that. It's just shocking to me that in the decades that people have been homebrewing, that nobody has experimented with it. So I think that feeling of being surprised by something definitely happens all the time, to this day, but I haven't been disappointed. I know we've made I think some people have been disappointed by our findings, but
have you played it all? You're talking about the temperature. Have you played it all with temperatures that change? Because obviously having a consistent fermentation temperature makes a big difference versus, a house that might go up and down a lot during the day, or your garage or something like that.
Yeah. You're not alone in thinking that. That's that is a question that we were asked a lot. And so Matt Delfiaco, actually, he designed an experiment just a few months ago where he compared a lager that was fermented at a consistent temperature versus, I believe it was a lager, versus the same beer. He split batch of the same beer where he intentionally brought the beer up. I think it was every 12 hours or so. He raised the temperature of the beer 10 degrees and then lowered it 10 degrees, really tried to force that yeast to do some weird things. And indeed, that one did come back statistically significant. The beer wasn't bad. Yeah, that's as far as I remember. The beer wasn't bad, but they were, people were able to tell them apart.
So there is some value in temperature control then, huh?
That's what that would seem to suggest. Yeah.
Yeah, I got one of those SS BrewTech things, so I've been playing with that, and it's kind of nice having just a little bit of control over the thing.
Yeah, is it the glycol thing, or? No,
I just got the one with a big you can put like a big ice bath on it or something. It works. Yeah, I can get it down into the 60s, so I've been thinking about trying a lager in it.
Yeah, well, you could try a lager at 66 if you want.
I can easily reach 66. That's not a problem at all.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to get on to your new projects. We're actually going through time here pretty quickly, but let's start with the Hop Chronicles.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the Hop Chronicles is a fun thing that we started, a year and a half ago or so. The idea being, let's see what people who aren't necessarily professionals in the hop industry. Let's see what they think of beers made with a particular hop variety solely. So it's single hop beers, and we serve it to them blind. And they're just told that it's a single hop beer, and we ask them to fill out a survey where they're kind of ranking 14 different descriptors, hop descriptors, in terms of aroma, and then they move on to flavor. And then we plot all of that information, and we average everything out. And so it's pretty cool. So basically the idea is that a brewer can go and say, what is it that tasters who don't know what the hop is, how do they perceive, say Citra or Galaxy? What is it they get from that hop? It's been a lot of fun.
And what are some of your findings so far?
So far, it's been pretty interesting. For me, what I think has been kind of cool is when we have a variety where the blind data actually aligns really well with what's already out there. So you take something like Willamette, it's known for being earthy and for not being terribly fruity or citrusy.
Yeah, it's a Fuggles variant, if I recall, right?
That's right. Yeah, and a lot of people will say you can use it in place of Fuggles. And in fact, we've got an experiment planned where, a Fuggles versus a Willamette. But for when we did the Hop Chronicles on this, sure enough, the blind tasters, their experience drinking a single hopped Willamette beer aligned beautifully with, the kind of what you've read about Willamette being. And I just thought that was so cool, and kind of gives us some validation as to what to expect from a hop like that. The other kind of what I think has been a lot of fun from the Hop Chronicles is testing out these experimental varieties. One in particular that comes to mind is Hopsteiner's Denali, which is a relatively new variety that hit the market. I was sent basically a brick of Denali, from a bale up in Yakima a couple years ago, and we made up a single hop Denali beer. And that hop is just so pungent and so citrusy and strong, but it also is balanced by a really nice kind of a floral, earthy background. And so you get to learn a lot about these new varieties that may not have as much research or established sensory data out there already.
Have you played a lot with some of the New Zealand ones? I know there's some interesting hop flavors coming out of New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, so surprisingly, those varieties are difficult to get these days. I can't recall if we've done any of the New Zealand ones just yet, but we have plans to get some. Riwaka is one that I really want to try, and then of course the Nelson Sauvin. Again, they're difficult to get our hands on at this point, but they're coming. Yeah, it's definitely coming.
Yep, and I want to mention those are also on your website at brulosophy.com. You can get them under the projects tab, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Projects, you'll see all the things that we're doing there, and I try to update those as regularly as I can.
And then, of course, you have another series called Short and Shoddy. Can you tell us about that one?
Short and Shoddy. This is a fun one. This is our newest series. We just started it, just rolled out the first article last week. In fact, it was written by our newest contributor, Jason Cipriani. Short and Shoddy is this idea that happened without intention. A couple years ago, I had some time, but not too much of it. My wife took a couple of my kids out, and I had one of them left with me, but I was just feeling like brewing. So I ran out to the garage real quick, gathered up just some stuff that I had lying around, and figured, you know what, I'm going to brew a all grain beer that's mashed for 15 minutes, boiled for 15 minutes, chilled as quickly as I can get it down to whatever my groundwater temp is, and then I'm just going to pitch the yeast and leave it alone. So that's about an hour-long brew day, and I just wanted to see what was going to happen. And surprisingly, the beer came out really good. It was a single hop Amarillo pale ale type thing. I think it was all Pilsner malt, actually.
Probably never be able to duplicate it, though, right?
I don't know. But it wasn't, I don't know if it was one of the, that wasn't one of those beers that I would write about, like go brew this beer. But I did write about it because I was so shocked that it actually worked, and it came out totally fine, but a really low efficiency, which I guess was expected. And so kind of inspired by that, a few of us went along and did some more of these short and shoddy brew days. We did a New England style IPA. I did an oatmeal porter, and as these beers kept coming out pretty good, I decided, you know what, let's blast through the entire BJCP guidelines and brew at least one of every beer that's listed in the guidelines using short and shoddy methods. And And so the series was born, and we just came out with the American Light Lager that Jason brewed using, I think he did a 20-minute mash, he did a 20-minute boil, which, you know, with that big Pilsner malt charge, you'd expect there to be some DMS or something in the beer. But he did all that. He fermented it warm with a lager yeast. And I think within about 2, maybe 3 weeks of brew day, he was serving it to people who were blind to the methods used, and just had them evaluate the beer. And surprisingly, 6 out of the I forget exactly how many participants he had, but 6 of them actually guessed that it was some form of an American lager.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah, hey, you know, to me that speaks volumes. And he you know, his impressions were that the beer was fantastic, and you know, he couldn't find any flaws in it.
Awesome. Well, that's really cool. So that's I assume that's gonna be an ongoing series, right?
Yeah, we're actually, I'm really excited about this one, only because I think it's so much fun. We're going to try to get that one, a couple articles out per month on those ones, and just try to get through the entire BJCP guidelines.
And then finally, I want to mention you started a new podcast. I think it was last winter, right? Something like that.
Yeah, the first episode came out in March of this year, and you know, we committed to dropping a new episode every other week at that point. It's been a lot of fun. And then starting in January, we're going to move to a weekly schedule. So I got my work cut out for me.
That's a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah. I bet.
I do one every other week, but I've been doing it for, since 2010, I think.
Yeah. Whew, it is.
So you're up to episode 14. What are some of the interesting things you've covered? What's the format? Talk about that and some of the things you've covered.
Yeah. So we, what we do, there's a lot of great brewing podcasts out there. This one being one of them that cover a lot of the brewing, techniques and methods and even some of the theory behind how to make beer and whatnot. And so we wanted it to be a little bit different and to stick with what we know best, which is experimentation and the stuff that we do on Brulosophy.com. And so our idea was to take basically one variable or one topic at a time, and then just dig into that and really go deep into that and talk about the way it's impacted our views. So we're a little less interview oriented and really just try to stick and focus on the stuff that we're doing on the website, kind of put a voice to what's already been written. And it's been really well received. You know, it seems like people like having that kind of, I think it's kind of nerdy, but that kind of thing to listen to when they're driving to and from work.
So it's a summary of experiments. How long is an average episode?
Average episode's going to be between 45 minutes and an hour.
So kind of like, I run about 45 minutes, give or take a few.
Yeah. So pretty standard format, I think. And yeah.
So you can find it, let's see, of course you can find it on Brulosophy.com, but
Sure.
You also got it on iTunes and several other services here, it looks like, yeah.
It's in all the places, indeed. And, if you a lot of people were, when we first put it out there, people were complaining about not being able to find it when they use the umlaut in Brulosophy. So, drop it for this and you should be able to find it just fine.
Cool. Any other interesting projects going on, Marshall? I know you always get something new going on.
Oh, with we're working on, people have been asking us to kind of use our, the triangle test approach that we have with, cloning commercial beers. So that's something we've been looking into. But as it sits right now, our goal is just to get to the point where we feel comfortable enough pumping out an episode every week of the podcast before we take on any more crazy responsibilities.
This has grown into quite a project for you, I think, right? Yeah. I mean, I know you got a lot of contributors, but still. Yeah,
it really has. And I give massive credit to my contributors that, the guys who really are behind keeping this thing afloat and alive. And I'll admit, a lot of the reason we do things the way that we do is because I like it that way. As a consumer of this type of information, regular articles or a regular podcast with this type of information is what I would like. And so I'm just trying to kind of build this thing into something that I think people who share that will enjoy, and so, yeah, it's a big responsibility. My wife reminded me last week that I spend more time on Brulosophy now than I do my 40-hour-a-week job. So
Isn't
whatever
that
that's
interesting?
Worth.
So yeah. You should just quit your regular job. That's what I did.
Well, if only the income would supplement it, I would consider that.
Yeah, that's always a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. You published 160 plus experiments now so far. You got your Hop Chronicles, the new podcast. I was wondering what advice you might pass on to the average home brewer before we close here.
Yeah.
Can you summarize it all in just a couple minutes here?
Oh gosh, yeah, I can probably less than that. I'm a psychologist in real life. That's what I do for and so I'm not too good at advice giving, because when I hear advice, I hear somebody looking for the easy way out, right?
Well, most homebrewers are warped personalities, so that fits well.
Oh, speak for yourself, Brad. Right?
I certainly am. So
yeah, likewise. I don't. Yeah, so that's why I drink. My biggest piece of advice is have fun. Don't take this stuff too seriously. Beer is meant to be fun. We drink it to have a good time. If you're competition minded and you really think that traditional approaches are what's going to allow you to win those gold medals, then by all means, no one here is judging you for that. Go do it. Have a great time. Share your beer, and make this hobby, the best one there is out there, or keep it the best, I should say.
Well, thank you, Marshall. Really appreciate you coming on the show again. It's been too long. We got to get you on again soon. We had so much material I didn't even get through it all, but love to have you on again soon.
Absolutely, Brad. Thanks for having me on again. I really do enjoy talking with you.
And of course, my guest today was the one and only Marshall Schott, who runs the Brulosophy.com website, which I highly recommend. You can find some amazing experiments there. Of course, the Hop Chronicles, Short and Shoddy, and his new Brulosophy podcast. Thanks again, Marshall.
Thanks.
A big thank you to Marshall Schott for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on Google Play, iTunes, or the Amazon app stores. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.